Hello. So in the last video, we talked about the step forward that Anaximenes took sort of in relation to Thales and Anaximander who came before. And we talked about how he came up with this difference of substance and quality. Or rather, he sort of, didn't come up with the distinction, but he came nearer, let's say, to the distinction of substance and quality when talking about air. When talking about condensation and rarefaction of this one substance, which then goes from a neutral form to sort of denser substances. So it's the same substance. The substance remains the same, but the quality changes. So think of it in that sense. Yeah. So in this video, we will talk about. We'll delve a little bit more into the question of what makes. What is air as Archē, rather, not what makes, but what is air as Archē, right? As Archē, remember, it is that out of which all things, remember, it's a primary principle, so all things have their being, all things have their beginning, and into which all things are resolved again, So when we're talking about Archē in philosophy, not Archē in the very general sense it is used in the Greek language, we are talking about something that is, and especially with natural philosophy, we're talking about something that is, an underlying substance through and through, right? So it is something from which everything begins, in which everything has its being, and into which everything is resolved again. Why? Because it's a monist philosophy. As we already sort of talked about, it is both the thing that is set into motion and the cause of motion, which means that it is self-moving. It is self-moving and it is eternally moving, and which means that there is this trueness. I don't know if that's even a proper word, but it's present throughout in phenomena, right? So if we start thinking of air as Archē and air as this one substance which doesn't change, which remains the same, in all circumstances, then what do we understand of the process by which these changes occur? Right? So, and this is, as I said, is the place where Anaximenes takes his step forward. So, what Anaximenes is looking for is a natural explanation, right? He's trying to find an explanation within nature and also a somewhat mechanistic explanation, not yet completely mechanistic, as I said, because there is still the idea of self-motion that is there, which in a mechanistic explanation you would require somebody else that moves things, a deus ex machina, if you want to think of it that way. With Anaximenes, he doesn't want a deus ex machina. There's only one deus, there's only one God, one thing that is divine, which is air, which means that the deus is in machina, which means that air itself needs to be the cause of its own motion. It's both the substance that is changed and the agent of change, right? So, what did he want to change? We already talked about this. What shifted from Anaximander is that Anaximander's explanation, if you think about it, if you're thinking in terms of natural explanation, it invoked no sort of known recognizable process of nature. There is no recognizable process of nature unless you count humans, or maybe some animals as well, which invoke sort of which brings in war and injustice and struggle for prominence and recompense and retribution. So these are not sort of recognizable processes of nature. So Anaximander's explanation of change, though extremely cool, I still think, are not immediately sort of recognizable in simple terms. In fact, this will come back with Heraclitus, and we talked about Heraclitus last time as well, the Anaximanderian concept of change, which was the struggle of opposites, this war and struggle, which we'll look at again. But right now we're trying to find a more sort of naturalistic explanation. So, if you want to account, and as Anaximenes did, I'm sure, for cosmos, for the world order, and we've talked about cosmos quite a lot, by natural causes, right? By what he would see as natural causes, then it's a very sort of, desire which is now thought of as a scientific desire, to try and find these causes, to try and find these origins in some process that we can even verify now, some verifiable process, rather than be like, well, water wanted revenge against fire for evaporating it, and then fire wanted revenge against water for evaporating it. Sorry, putting it out. I'm confusing the two. Anyway, you get the idea, right? So the thing is that what Anaximenes, or anybody looking for this kind of a naturalistic explanation would want, is to find some process in nature which can be verified, which is verifiable at any point. And this verifiability you can see to some extent in when you see the transformation of one form of matter into another. And this process, at least, that is verifiable. I mean, it's not that one would agree entirely that air itself is condensed and rarefied, and we can verify it. I'm not talking about that kind of an experimental level, but more of the process of rarefaction and condensation is something that we can see in nature. Right, in nature, at least with water, for example, the one that Thales was talking about, you see that water condenses into ice and water evaporates into air, into mist, and steam, and then into mist, into clouds, and then turns back into rain. So you can see this transformation, which the process of it, Anaximander explained as condensation and rarefaction. So why air, to get back to the question of this video, is that air differs, at least according to Anaximenes, in rarity and density according to the different substances, right? And this is what the section I read out earlier from Theophrastus and Hippolytus, talked about, that air, he would say, rarefied becomes fire, air condensed becomes wind, and air, this wind further condensed becomes cloud or becomes mist, and then becomes water and becomes earth and becomes stones. There's a higher level of density that is going. There's some kind of a linear process that you can think about, this air rarefied and air condensed. And so the idea that everything then in the world is constituted of these things, and that eternal motion can cause this kind of a change, right? So air, again, we already talked about this in the last video to some extent, is a substance which Anaximenes, I think, was one of the first people, or the first person, for whom it came to mean this invisible substance that we call air today. We talk about air here like this. Between me and the camera right now, there is air, right? I can't see it; it's invisible to the eye, but it's there. I assume it's there. I can feel it. There are other senses apart from sight as well that say something. So before this, as I said, it meant this dark mist, this fog, something that stopped vision. Right now, with Anaximenes, air is something through which you can see. It actually permits vision. So this invisible, the idea of this invisible substance, sort of came in with Anaximenes. And the idea of, I think what was the word was equable, right? So it is the idea that it is where it is most evenly distributed. This idea of equability is this idea of equal distribution, even distribution, uniformity. And so when air is evenly distributed and uniform, it is something that is invisible. This is a pretty interesting idea. That, the visibility of air comes when it changes from its equable, neutral form, right? Its primary natural state leaves it invisible. And this is an idea that, because as I said, the series of lectures is going towards atomism, and in atomism then, they talk about the primary substance being something that is entirely invisible. These atoms are not visible at all because they're too tiny for vision. Here, the idea is not too tiny. Here, the idea is something else. Here, the idea is that it is, when it is, evenly distributed, uniform in its primary natural state, it is invisible, which means that the world is constituted by something that is invisible in its primary or natural state. Yep. With Anaximander, the apeiron was something that is indefinite. We don't know anything about visibility. It was something that is indefinite, so much more abstract. If we start asking, okay, what does it look like? What does it smell like? We don't know. But with air, it is something that is physical and present, but at the same time, it is invisible in its primary state. It's something that you can't really sort of, immediately see. And it is made visible by the process of change. Any process of change, so any sort of shift in this equilibrium would render it visible, right? And how do you have this shift in equilibrium? You have it by, the action of heat. When it becomes hotter, it becomes visible because it sort of becomes fiery. Air becomes aether, if you want to think of it that way. When it becomes cooler, then it becomes, more solidified and present. So you see it as, mist and water and rain and, and earth and stones. So there is a state of equilibrium where it is uniform, where it is invisible, yet it is in constant motion. So it is not still, right? It's not still air. Even here it's in constant motion, but it's in constant motion in a kind of equilibrium, right? The actual change happens because it is rarefied or condensed, and that too, it rarefies and condenses by itself. The eternal motion causes it, and even now it's not really clear how exactly that eternal motion causes it. This will be properly explained, I feel, only with the atomists. Because with the other pluralists, with Empedocles and Anaxagoras that we are going to encounter, they actually bring in a second cause of motion. We'll do this later, but with just to give you a preview of them. With Empedocles, what he would say is that there are these two acting forces. So he would differentiate between forces and substance, and these two acting forces of attraction and repulsion will sort of cause things to move. And with Anaxagoras, who again we'll look at later, and please don't confuse his name with Anaximander or Anaximenes. I know there are too many X's everywhere. So with Anaxagoras, then there is this kind of a mind, this noia, which is looking at everything, and that sort of again leads in a bit of a theological direction, I feel, even though that wasn't their intention and that's not what they're necessarily doing, but it leads to again this kind of a dualism. This they are pluralist, but there is a kind of dualism in them. So it's only with the atomists that we again have an idea of motion that is caused by that is sui generis, that is motion which is caused by itself. They don't need an external cause of motion, and they explain it via something called a vortex, which is extremely cool, which was sometimes ascribed to Anaximenes as well, but it's most likely a kind of attribution of a later thought to somebody earlier to understand this gap in Anaximenes about motion, where the idea was that while these air molecules, if you want to think of it, this is very atomist terms of thinking about it, even in terms of molecules or air atoms, when they are because they're in constant movement, they sometimes sort of crash against each other, and then they at some point they form a kind of critical mass, and then things change, and then things the sort of bigger changes go forward. The thing is that this was an atomist idea, which is not too far away, just about like another 100 years or so. So from Anaximenes, and 100 years is really not that much time. But with Anaximenes yet, we don't really know exactly why it goes into disequilibrium. It is in constant motion, yes, but there must be some reason that sends it into disequilibrium. And if we don't have an external thing, like, with a second thing because it's a monist philosophy, then the cause of disequilibrium is not very clear. Which with Anaximander, it was a kind of poetical idea, as Simplicius called it, which was the poetical idea was that it was because of injustice and recompense. With Thales, we have so little. We really have so little material that we are just left guessing. That did he actually talk about the cause of change? Maybe he did come up with some sort of a notion which is close to Anaximenes about the change of matter into one into another, but we don't know. With Anaximenes, where we still don't have that much, again, very little, but we have enough to understand that he did start thinking about the causes of motion, the causes of change, and he started nearing the distinction of substance and quality, which we would see in Aristotle later on. Yeah. So it sort of what we see with Anaximenes is that he took a step forward, as I already said, towards this distinction. And so he, and this distinction really, there's this distinction between substance and affection and this idea of change and the process of change, he would have developed it, one assumes, because that's the only way, I think, of getting there, through observation, right? What do you observe? Do you observe this dark mist that obscures you all the time? Not really, yeah? I mean, there are dark clouds somewhere and there is mist sometimes, but the normal state of affairs is that you have this invisible substance which you can feel but you cannot see. And so the idea is that the normal thing that you find, the natural invisible thing that is there, is air, right? Air is natural, uniform. When it is uniform, it also seems to be fairly uniform. It changes, and when it changes, you can see. When there are changes in air, you can see clouds and rain and all kinds of things. So there is a kind of uniformity there, and this uniformity is invisible, right? Or rather, air is invisible due to this uniformity, and that is its natural state. Also, through observation, you can find that a certain level of condensation, or at least that's what he observed, led to the formation of mist. It seemed like this air itself becomes mist, or air becomes wind, and this wind, is again not very visible, but it's more more tangible than pure air. Air. I have to move my hand to be able to feel it, but wind I'll feel, or a breeze I'd feel, even without having to move. So there is a higher level of tangibility, even though there is not extreme visibility. And then at some point, with mist or with fog, it becomes even more tangible, and it indeed becomes visible. And and the rain then is even more tangible and visible. And then it is going towards a sort of certain level of solidification. So condensation leads to a solidification of this whatever natural invisible substance that we have. And when rarefied, when heated, you would see, like if you see the action of sometimes the sun on a big body of water, and if it's really hot, you would see this little bit of steam coming out, right? And this idea that, heated, there's some kind of a steam, and maybe because of the action of the sun, I don't know why, but he believed that, it was a fiery element. Also the idea of hotness. It doesn't mean that there isn't, hot water or hot stone, or there is no sort of, cold, well, you see, I mean, okay, let's not go into that at all. But the idea is that this is something that he would have gotten from observation. He would have gotten this from looking at the world around and thinking, oh, there are different substances in the world. There are, but these apparent differences that one sees in the kind of substance that we have are differences of quality, and not really of substance itself. It's not that there are 4 different kinds of substances, not even, a single substance is broken into 4 different kinds of substances, as you had with Anaximander, but the same substance with difference of quality. And so, for the first time, you think about it, it's a shift from, like, quantity to quality, right? So and if you think about air as being this uniform, still thing, if it condenses, what is happening is that in a smaller space, you have a greater quantity. And when it is rarefied in a bigger space, you have lesser quantity. So in fact, what you have here is quantity turning into quality, right? Quantitative difference of the amount of air turning into qualitative difference in the kind of substance that you find. It's the same substance, but quantity changes into quality. Yeah? So qualitative differences come from quantitative differences, and this really is a huge leap, I think. It's a huge leap in scientific thinking, that differences of kind or quality are now, with Anaximenes, are reduced to a common origin in differences of quantity. Yeah? Quantity turns into quality, which means that all diversities that we see in this world are due to the presence of more of a substance or less of a substance in a given space, as I said. Yeah, in a one single given space, you have more of a substance or less of a substance, and so you're thinking really in terms of quantitative differences shifting into qualitative sort of differences. So one sort of last question. Why air as Archē? What does air add when we make air Archē? With what Anaximenes sort of why he would have chosen, I would imagine, again, we are all imagining because they don't give reasons why, they explain, but from there you can derive answers to this question. Condensation and rarefaction, I think, explains it very well, and quantity and quality explains it really well. It's a natural explanation, as we already said. It's a natural explanation. It's an explanation that you can get through observation, which is semi-verifiable at any point of time. And it's an explanation that doesn't require really to have a second substance. There was this great desire for monism. Why? Because you saw with Hesiod, right, and Homer, the number of gods, and the greater the number of explanations, the more confusion. So this desire for order, this is almost an aesthetic desire to find a single substance, and this aesthetic desire remains even now with people wanting to find this God particle, single explanation. We don't want both, general relativity and quantum mechanics. We want like one big sort of theory which explains theory of everything, So even then, they had this desire to find like this one explanation, this one clean, beautiful, minimal, aesthetically minimal explanation, which air for Anaximenes seemed to provide, right? So it is this consistent, the desire, the choice of air as Archē is sort of consistent with this monistic view of reality. Then another question that we could ask is why eternal motion? Again, as I've already sort of, this is just more of a summary now that I'm doing. Why eternal motion is because then at that time there was no clear distinction as yet between substance, between inert matter and a force. So when we talked about Empedocles and Anaxagoras, they were making a difference between inert matter and a force that acts, and the force that causes it to move. So this sort of Newton's second law, right? That a thing would remain in constant, in a perpetual rest or perpetual motion until acted upon by an external force. Sorry, I'm quoting from memory. I think it's the second law. Or maybe it's the first law. One of them is the first, one's the second. Force is mass and acceleration. Anyway, you can look it up. So the same sort of, there's this difference between inert matter. Matter was not inert, with these monists, as you can see, matter is not inert, air is not inert, water is not inert, the apeiron was not inert. There is no sort of such clear distinction between inert, dead, like inorganic in that sense, later idea of inorganicity, inorganic matter. So that's why motion was always thought of as eternal. And also this allows them to again have a monist world, which we already talked about, this thing that we have one single explanation for everything, one single substance from which everything, and that substance can move by itself. And so this Archē again becomes something that is eternal, which is self-caused, which is self-moving. And if you remember, this becomes the idea of the divine. So again, I think this, let me see if I can find this quote, is that air, yeah. So this is from Cicero, yeah, much later that is then, from the Nature of the Gods. He says, afterwards, Anaximenes determined that air is a god and that it comes into being and is measureless and infinite and always in motion, as though either formless air could be a god or mortality did not attend upon everything that has come into being. Anaximenes, this is from IISER, says that air is God. One must understand, in the case of such descriptions, the powers which interpenetrate the elements or bodies. Right? Or the last one is from Augustinus. Okay. He says, Anaximander, that is, left Anaximenes as his disciple and successor, who attributed all the causes of things to infinite air and did not deny that there were gods or passed them over in silence, yet he believed not that air was made by them, but that they arose from air. Okay, so these three quotes again, bring in the question of divinity, right? That air is something that is divine, that is something that is, and it is divine because it is eternal, it is undying, it is self-moving. So something that is alive, as I said, there are two things that you need to check. Is it alive? Is it eternal? Right, in the sense that it is undying, right? It doesn't die and it is alive, which means it becomes something that's divine. And the extra explanation that you saw from, I think it was from IISER, was that also it sort of interpenetrates everything. It's everywhere. It's, if it's a divinity, it's a kind of pantheistic divinity of air, if you want to think of it in terms of what theism is it. Same with water and same with Apeiron, like if you want to think of all of them as divine. So if you want to think of them not as atheistic philosophies, but as, philosophies that do contain some idea of divinity, you can think of them as pantheistic philosophy because there's a hylozoism, the aliveness of matter, the lifelike nature of matter, and the sort of, eternality of this matter and the interpenetration of this matter into everything makes them more of a pantheistic philosophy, because then substance, it sounds almost like Spinoza actually, so substance becomes God, substance is God and God is substance, matter is God. So if you want to think of it in terms of religion, it's not exactly a religion that's recognizable as, a practiced Greek religion, in the sense that it's not a polytheistic sort of religion. It's not even a religion like you have with the Orphics, with some level of mixed polytheism and reincarnation. And, so here what you have then is a kind of pantheistic philosophical notion. And this is a more philosophical notion of divinity. If divinity enters in philosophy, often enough it does enter in a more sort of pantheistic manner than in, a monotheistic or polytheistic manner, as we will see. Anyway, so what you have here with the early monist philosophies is this, if at all a divinity, then a pantheistic sort of a divinity. Substance is all, and all is substance, and this substance then is, I suppose, God. One last thing about air is that, there was a popular association at that time even between breath, breathing, and the soul. So between pneuma, and pneuma, the word pneumatic, for example, comes from that. So this idea of pneuma rather, p nu epsilon upsilon mu and alpha, pneuma, and psyche, right? Psyche, which is soul or which is life. You can think of it in terms of, it was translated later as anima into Latin, or rather the equivalent word in Latin is anima, and in English you can call it life or soul. There are two ideas that this psyche covers. And psychology, for example, comes from psyche, Anyway, let's not go into the whole sort of etymology business of things. So there was a popular association, and the word that he's using for air is not necessarily always air that we were talking about, the dark mist air, but also pneuma, breath. And then the idea is that just as our soul, which is air, and this is an idea that you had in ancient times and also in Anaximenes, just as our soul, which is air, holds us together, so breath and air surround the whole cosmos, right? So what you have here then with air, and let me see if I can find this quote as well. Sorry, I'm like constantly looking for quotes out here. Yeah. Right, so this is from Aetius again. He says, Anaximenes, a son of Eurystratus of Miletus, declared that air is a principle of existing things. For from it all things come to be, and into it they are again dissolved. As our soul, he says, being air holds us together and controls us, so does breath and air enclose the whole world. Air and breath or wind are synonymous here. And do we have another quote? I think that's the only one. But this idea then of, let's say, of the equivalence of soul and air or breath and air, what is happening here is then that he's making a kind of analogy between the microcosm and the macrocosm, if you want to think of it in terms of microcosm and macrocosm, because if the world is this alive, breathing thing, right? It's alive, it's breathing, it's the macrocosm, which is the world, is alive and breathing in the same way, and breathing with air, in the same way we as humans, and each and every being, is alive and living as a breathing sort of creature with air, and so there is this. And he's one of the early philosophers to again talk about the soul. You did not see it in we didn't have much from Thales, and Anaximander as well. We just had two quotes, so he might have talked about it. I don't know, but with from Anaximenes we have a clear quote given by Aetius, where you have this idea of breath, of soul, as being something that is both in the microcosm of each being and in the macrocosm of the whole cosmos. By the way, microcosm and macrocosm, do note, both contain the word cosmos. The order of a single creature, a single being in this world, and the order, the beautiful ordering of the whole universe, are both analogous, because both of them are composed of, both of them are alive in that sense because of this soul, this breath, this breathing sort of matter which constitutes. So that's another reason, if you want to go back to our earlier question of why is air archē? The answer then would be that, yes, we can understand it in terms of substance and quality, in terms of quantity and quality. It's a natural explanation. It's a verifiable explanation. It also is something that you can start thinking of it in terms of eternal motion. If you think of it in terms of breath, breath is eternally moving. If you're alive, you're eternally moving. And this air, which is eternally alive, is also eternally moving. So you can understand it in terms of eternal motion, but you can also understand it in terms of this interpenetration of all things, which means this sort of, it's in everything, air is in everything, and in terms of this life, right? Air itself is what gives life, what is life. Life itself is to be thought of, life or soul is to be thought of in terms of, breathing and air. So that's another reason for the choice, one could argue, of air as archē for Anaximenes. Thank you.